Thank you all for joining this informative webinar on a NEHI focused genetic study. My name is Carly Bush. I am the president and co-founder of the NEHI Research Foundation. My journey with NEHI began when my son Mason was diagnosed at 17 months old. He is now 13 and loves all sports, especially baseball. My husband and I started the foundation in 2018. Over the years, I've met countless families from the newly diagnosed to young adult patients. I'm grateful for all the connections I've made and the support I've been able to offer. But the truth is, there are still far too many unknowns. I truly believe the best way to create better futures for our NEHI warriors is through research. With this goal in mind, the foundation has funded a genetic study that will be led by Dr. Wendy Chung, whom I'm honored to introduce you to today. Dr. Wendy Chung is a clinical and molecular geneticist and the chief of the Department of Pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Chung directs NIH-funded research programs in human genetics of pulmonary hypertension, breast cancer, obesity, diabetes, autism, birth defects including congenital diaphragmatic hernia and congenital heart disease. Dr. Chung is a national leader in the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomics. She was the recipient of the Rare Impact Award from the National Organization of Rare Disorders and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Physicians. Dr. Chung received her BA in biochemistry from Cornell University, her MD from Cornell University Medical College, and her PhD from the Rockefeller University in genetics. Thank you, Dr. Chung, for all you've done for the rare disease community and your willingness to take on this NEHI study. Hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Carly. I'm also joined today by genetic counselor Rebecca Hernan, who some of you may get the chance to meet. For me, I'll say it always starts and ends with the patient. And for me, this journey started also with a patient with NEHI, who came to me with the question of what caused this? Why do I have this? Or his parents actually asked this. And I realized we did genetic testing the most we could at the time, and we didn't come up with an answer. And that was frustrating for them and for me, because we still to this day wonder if there could be a genetic answer. And we realized at the time, looking at one person at a time, somewhat limited when we don't know what we're looking for. And when we band together and look together and do some comparisons across individuals, we're stronger and we learn faster. So with this, Carly, I will give a lot of credit to, really had that same vision in terms of being able to work together. And I'm glad to say that we're now going to do this in an organized way. So let me share my slides, and this will be available afterwards, so that if anyone has questions, you can think about it again with any of your friends, family, doctors, anyone who's helpful in terms of thinking about this. I'm sorry, I didn't start this at the beginning. There we go. So I'm Wendy Chung. Not surprisingly, I'm a geneticist, and this is about genetics. And this is about filling our gaps with genetic knowledge with the hope that over time, this information is useful to you, useful to your doctors, and useful to your children and your family members. So with this, I can't guarantee that all of you are going to find an answer or when you'll find an answer in terms of the genetics, but I do have a feeling that for many of you, the answer to the why question, what caused NEHI and what is this going to mean for the future, may be along the genetic dimension. This has been true for me with many other conditions. In particular, Carly mentioned pulmonary hypertension. I started that journey about 20 years ago to understand that as another type of lung condition. And we're taking a lot of those learnings from that rare condition in children and applying them to NEHI. In doing this, we've realized that although it has a single clinical label or clinical diagnosis, not everyone's the same. And it's been very important for us to learn the underlying genetic causes to stratify or divide individuals with NEHI into kind of subcategories. This has then been associated with differences in terms of prognosis or what happens in the future, allowing us to plan for what to expect, and also has resulted in some differences in treatment. And effectiveness of treatment and maybe risks and benefits as well. I don't know for sure if that's going to happen with NEHI, but that's the reason, the thinking behind doing this. As we do this, we're going to do this ideally as a family affair when we have the opportunity to do this. And as I'll explain, that's because inclusion of multiple members of the family, namely the person with NEHI, as well as in many cases their parents, can help us recognize things faster. And we want to be able to do this in a timeline that gets information to you all individually and then collectively to come up with answers. I'll explain the workflow for how we're going to do this, but the bottom line is we're going to look for answers immediately on our first pass to get you information quickly, but we're also going to keep looking and iterating so that as more families come into the study over time, we'll look back and look again at the information because we realize that, as I said, just like my very first patient with NEHI, we may not recognize the answer immediately in the first pass. So just to say, why do we even think there might be a genetic basis for NEHI? I'd say there are a few reasons. Number one is for some of you, this runs in families. And when we do see things that run in families, it doesn't guarantee it's genetic, but it certainly makes it more likely. Number two, it happens early in life. And in general, conditions that happen early in life in children, in particular ones that are severely impacting health and sometimes even life limiting, often have genetic causes. And it's only been relatively recently in the last 10 years or so that we've been able to recognize that even when it does not run in families. And let me be clear, even if it does not run in the family in the sense of having multiple family members with NEHI, there's still a good chance that it could be genetic. Finally, we're just starting to understand some of the genes associated, and there are now, there's in fact one significant gene associated with NEHI, in part described by one of my collaborators, Jin's son, that we're starting to understand better. So we do know that there definitely are genes, and we've had some successes in terms of learning about this, and I'm sure we're going to have many more over time as we go through this study. So as we do this, again, I wanted there to be a reason for individual families to participate and to be meaningful individually to each of the families and also collectively as we learn together. So we've designed the study in what I think of as a relatively novel way. I'll emphasize that this is a research study, so we do want to have your permission and consent to do research. And this is also free to you. That is, that there's no cost associated with this. And we hope that there may be some direct or indirect benefit for all the participants, but this is definitely research and we're learning together. We're learning together specifically around NEHI as we go forward. And as we're doing this, we hope that the information that we're giving back to you individually is going to help you and your doctors to learn and plan going forward. We do realize that this is going to take time in some cases, even after we identify genes, to understand the conditions better. And so this is not necessarily, I'll just prepare you, a one and done sort of study. This may be a long-term journey as we're learning together. What I mean by that is even after we describe genes, we may not know that much about what those genes or genetic conditions are or how they evolve. So we'll need to follow over time to learn from you about how that evolves. Learn how, for instance, certain medications may be helpful, maybe some may be harmful, but we want to be able to learn together because it's likely that there aren't going to be that many of us at the beginning. So we're going to have to collectively pool our knowledge, work with your doctors in terms of understanding that. Then there may be researchers who are not doctors, but that maybe, for instance, have animal models either that they already have or develop, because as an example, mice age faster than people. So we may develop animal models to be able to study those conditions in animals that can we can be able to look at responses to certain medications. We may be able to see how disease progresses, but we may be able to do it on a faster timeline to be able to help your family. So operationally, hopefully you get the idea behind this. What's involved? What do I have to do? How easy or difficult is it? So I hope this will make this very concrete. We have tried and worked, used information from some of my other studies to make this as painless as possible. And some of these other studies are much, much larger than this study. And so we've had lots of time and ability to iterate and to make this, as I think, both very easy, but also very scientifically solid. So we're going to do this with you. And in doing this with you, what I mean by that is that you can do it from the ease of doing from your home. You don't have to travel to Boston, although I'm in Boston. You don't have to come to Boston to be able to do this. It's all within your control and your ability to do it from your living room on your time. Could be 10 o'clock at night, but to do it on your timeline. So what do we need to do? Well, we need you to answer some questions. These are relatively brief survey questions that will take about 10 to 20 minutes to do it, where we are focused on the person with NEHI and you being able to respond to some questions about the clinical journey, about the symptoms, about the diagnosis. And in some cases, we may need to document this with medical records. We'll get back to you in terms of what medical records we might need. Many of you have access to that on your phone or on the computer through MyChart or other things, whatever your own portal is. But we'll be able to go back to you, and if we need to, have you sign a medical release to get certain medical records if you're not able to get those on your own. A key portion of this, as I said, based on this being a genetic study, is to get some information about family history. For many of you, that may be very easy because there is no family history of NEHI in your family, save the one person who has it. In other cases, there may be two siblings, two of your children, for instance, that have this, or perhaps a parent and child. So it may be very easy for you to report that. It may be complex and convoluted. You may have a first cousin once removed or someone who's a distant relative. So if necessary, Becca will work with you and talk it out with you on the phone if it's one of those more complex histories. But we'll get your family history. And in many cases, if there is another family member who's living and affected with NEHI, it would be very helpful to have them included in the study themselves. Okay, so that's the part that you do on the computer online. After that, we need to get some samples to get DNA because this is a genetic study and we're going to be sequencing your DNA to try and find the genetic variant or variants that we think are causing NEHI. A very easy way to get a source for DNA is a saliva sample. So spitting into a tube, essentially. So this makes it easier because there are no pokes, so no one has to get blood drawn. You can do it from the convenience of your home, and you can do it any time of day or night. We simply ask that you don't eat for 30 minutes prior to giving that saliva sample. That way we make sure we're getting cells from you and not cells from your turkey sandwich. And with that, we can do the studies that we need to do. So we're going to be getting on each person who participates and signs a consent. Each individual person has to consent to the study. We'll be getting a saliva sample, and that'll allow us to do the DNA analysis. With that, we're going to be doing something called exome sequencing. If people have questions, I'm glad to explain that. But basically, that means looking at 20,000 genes. So as you can imagine, this is a massive amount of information. And within those 20,000 genes, we're looking for a needle in a haystack. So we're literally looking for one or two genetic variants out of hundreds of thousands of genetic variants. Many of these are just normal genetic variants, not causing NEHI, but we have to find those one or two that are responsible for NEHI. So this is a massive undertaking. We're pretty good at being able to do this. We've done this many times before, so we think we're up for the task, but even still, it's hard to do. So why do we do this as a family affair? In some cases, this genetic variant for NEHI we expect is going to be new in a child with NEHI and not present in either of their parents. In those cases, we expect there to be no family history, at least not in most of the cases. And the reason we include the parents is because we can do a very quick inventory, variant by variant, across all 20,000 genes to see what's unique in a child and not present in the parents. And we've used this strategy several times before, and it's very efficient and allows us to rapidly recognize certain genetic variants that are associated with disease. We predict this will actually help us to turn results back around back to families in the fastest way. So if we find a genetic variant in a gene that we think is strongly suspicious for NEHI and present in the child with NEHI and not the parents, those are likely the results that are going to come back fastest to you. Not to say that we won't return other results, and we might not recognize them either immediately or over time, but they might take some experience to be able to recognize. What do I mean by experience? Well, when we see it just in one family, lots of times we're not certain if it's a brand new gene that's never been associated with disease. We're not sure that it's the answer. But when we see it in a second family or a third family, we gain confidence that it is the answer. So we may, if you're the very first family, we may not return it to you until we find a second family or a third family. But by the time we find the third family, we'll return it to all three. That's what I meant by going back and being able to reanalyze over time. So what does this mean for your time frame? Well, we will analyze the data right away. So as soon as your samples come in, let's say it's mom, dad, and child, as soon as those three samples come in, we will run the analysis. We will look at it right away. We will be doing this in real time, not in batches, but every single family as they come in, we're going to be going through and analyzing. So if we see it right away, we'll return it right away. And as we return it right away, it'll be a combination likely with a genetic counselor and geneticist like myself to be able to return that and explain that to you. And likely we'll do that by video. We won't make you come to Boston to do that. Obviously, that'd be a pain, but we'll return it right away and provide you with written documentation of what that is. And we'll contact you likely by phone or email to let you know that we have something and then set up the time for being able to do that. So as we're doing it, though, that time frame of 3 to 6 months may say we don't have an answer yet, and I underscore yet. That means on the first analysis, we don't have an answer, but we will keep going back and looking at it over and over again as more people come into the study. Or we may say, yes, we have an answer now, and we'll tell you more about it. So as we think about who to actually be in the research study, like I said, every individual person needs to have their own consent that they sign. It's electronic, so you can do it online, but every member of a family needs to have that. So even if there's only one person with NEHI, but both parents who are going to participate, three individuals need to consent. We need to have at least one person in the family with NEHI. So if you're a family where you did have a child previously affected, but they're no longer living and there's no way of being able to get a DNA sample, it's hard for us to analyze that. So we need to have at least one person in the family with NEHI. After that, we can take other members of the same family with NEHI. We can take the biological parents. We can even take other siblings, even if they don't have NEHI. But the most important people are the person with NEHI and those biological parents. That helps us for all the reasons I described. So how do you start that process? If you've listened to this and you say, yeah, I'd like to find out more, I'd like to potentially be able to participate in this, this is one of the keys. That email right there, Chung Genetic Research at childrens.harvard.edu, that starts your journey. So if you can take a screenshot of this, you can write it down, we can send it around afterwards, but the on-ramp to come in is this Chung Genetic Research at childrens.harvard.edu. If you can, put in the subject line of that email, NEHI, NEHI. That'll help us in terms of making sure that we get you onboarded very quickly. The next thing we're going to do is help you with an electronic consent. Again, that's online. You can do it from your phone, a tablet, a library, at the computer there, your own personal library, computer at home, at work, wherever you'd like, but you can do it through any of those electronic means. And then you've got those brief surveys that I described. So all told, it should take less than an hour. And depending on how fast you fill these things out, it could be even less than half an hour. But I think less than an hour to be able to do this. We'll then send you those kits to collect the saliva sample via FedEx. We need a mailing address to send those, and then you send those back to my laboratory via FedEx as well. All of that's paid for by the study, so none of this costs you anything, just a little bit of time. As I said, it takes us a little bit of time. About 3 to 6 months is what we're estimating based on some of my other studies to be able to get you a result. And the results at this point will come in the two flavors. Like I said, we may say that there's a genetic cause that's been identified. We'll reach out to let you know that the genetic, we need to set up a time to tell you about that. Once we do, we'll send issue or you'll get a copy of the actual clinical laboratory results, and we hope that you share that with your doctors. Glad to talk with your doctors also, but the important thing is to share that documentation with them. If we don't have a result yet, you won't get a clinical lab report about that because we want to keep analyzing this to see if there's something else that'll come up over time. But again, that doesn't mean your journey is over, and it doesn't exclude a genetic cause. It just means that we haven't identified one yet. I will say, and to set expectations, I think the majority of individuals initially will be getting an email that says no genetic cause identified yet, just to set expectations. We clearly gather momentum, and we recognize more things over time as more and more families come in. So, um, it's a rare condition, but the more we can spread the word and get more folks in, the more helpful it is to you and to everyone else. So again, I'm going to open this up for questions, but you've met me now. You've met Becca. Where there's one other member of our team who's here, Carrie Welch. She's a very experienced research geneticist, and she's going to be looking at much of this information with me, much of this genetic information that is. And again, if you'd like to start this journey with us, you can email chunggeneticresearch@childrens.harvard.edu. So let me pause there, and I know there's some questions. I'm going to leave this up for people that need to make a screenshot of this or jot that down. I'll leave this up for just another couple minutes, but then I'll take down the slides so you can see us better.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Chung. So for anyone who does have a question, just to make it totally clear, please go ahead and use the Q&A option. You can kind of see it down at the bottom of your screen and type it in. It'll be totally anonymous and we'll answer it live. So we've got just a couple of questions at the moment, and hopefully we'll get a few more as we continue on. But the first one, Dr. Chung, is just confirming if someone can participate if they live outside of the United States.
So I'm happy to try. Here's the limitation. With this, things will have to go through customs, and liquids going through customs, biological fluids in particular, have a tougher time getting through customs these days after COVID, I'll say, for understandable reasons, to make sure that transmissible conditions aren't being spread country to country. So I am willing to try, but I can't guarantee it's going to work, mainly because of the customs issue. But I will be willing to try.
Wonderful. I think the next question is about the likelihood of getting an answer. So we may not totally have those numbers, but what is the chance that we think that someone might get a result, a positive result?
That's a very good question. I'll be very honest, as Becca alluded to, we don't know the answer. If I had to make a best guess, and it is just a guess, but my best guess is at the beginning, it may be something like 10%. In other words, and I want to be sure to set expectations, it's definitely not going to be 50% or 100%, because we're at the beginning of learning about this condition. I do hope, though, that we have a lot of experience, as I said, about other lung conditions, other conditions in children. I'm hoping that experience is going to translate to NEHI to be able to make progress rapidly. But at the beginning, I don't want people to be disappointed or to think that there's not something genetic if we don't find out things right away. The other part of how quickly we learn and how quickly we get these results out are how many people collectively come into the study. If only 5 families come into the study, I don't think we're going to learn very rapidly. If we have 100 families come into the study, I think there's a chance we could learn very rapidly. So we'll see. Collectively, you all will, in part, determine your own destiny. So we'll work. We'll try and keep up with you as fast as you all decide to come in, and we'll try and keep up with the data as soon as it comes off the sequencers.
I think following in that question, there's a question about will all genetic variations be noted? And I think what the question is asking is, are we only looking for results that are related to NEHI and or other pulmonary issues, or will we be looking at other genetic issues as well?
That's a really good question. Someone was really insightful, and I should have discussed that, so I'm glad they brought up the question. We really are laser focused on the causes of NEHI. So we're not even looking, to be honest, for things that might be related to Alzheimer's risk or heart attacks or cancer risk, or we're really not looking for that. We're looking through the lens and with the objective of finding causes of NEHI, and we can't report out everything. So we're not going to be trying, and we're not going to be reporting on all of those other genetic things. This really is as I said, a study focused on NEHI. If you have concerns about those other things, a good thing is you don't have to be concerned, because we're not going to look for it, and if we're not looking for it, we shouldn't be finding it. If you do have concerns, on the other hand, about those things, we have lots of friends that are clinicians and geneticists around the country, around the world. We're certainly happy to help point you in the right direction of getting clinical testing for those types of conditions, and they're really good people who can help you answer that.
Wonderful. And then the next question that popped up is, what is the likelihood of having a second baby with NEHI if you already have one affected child?
That's a good question. In part, it depends on your own particular family history, and it depends if you have a child with NEHI about what their clinical features are associated with it. So it's a little hard to do this in a generic way, but I will say it's not zero. So even though there may be some individuals, as I said, without a family history yet, it may be because that, as you start having more children, it crops up, and then obviously the risk changes. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you have one child with NEHI and there's absolutely no other family history. In those cases, I think the probability is going to be low, less than 10%, but it's hard for me to give you any more precise answer to that until we start having more information. And if you collectively look amongst yourselves, I think you'll see that, I'll call it empirically, but in other words, based on experience, that's usually the case, that most parents that have one child with NEHI do not have other children, but it does happen sometimes. And so that's why I come up with the number of 10%. On the other hand, let me take another use case, which is that you have two children already with NEHI. In that case, it's probably a very different risk, and that risk could be 25 or 50%, depending on exactly what we see with what sex of the person is affected, and whether we see any other extended family members, either with NEHI or any related conditions. So the number really depends on your family history. And as I was saying before, but let me expand on what I said, you'll report your family history. If you do have questions about that, Rebecca is a genetic counselor, a certified genetic counselor, and you may have some questions like that. And if we want to talk about that offline on a case-by-case basis, we certainly can.
We had another question come in about family history, and the question is, in known NEH or NEHI families where it seems to run, is there a percentage of children that seem to have NEHI frequently? And I'm not.
So there could be situations, as I said, where the family pattern could be a parent to child. So what I mean by that is it's sort of goes down the family tree. In those cases, the expectation would be that it could be as high as 50%. That's not the rule in families with NEHI. That doesn't happen nearly as often. So I don't want to scare people about that. But it is theoretically possible. And for genetic reasons, we know about some of the gene or one of the genes involved, that could be the case. One of the reasons why families might find this useful is just to answer the question of what are the odds. The other thing about this is, once a gene and particular genetic variant are identified, I'm not saying you have to use the information, but there are ways of using this information with family planning about what you would do. Anything from whether or not you have more children, if you would adopt children, if you would use a sperm or egg donor, if you'd use prenatal diagnosis, if you'd use something called in vitro fertilization and test the embryos before you get pregnant. Lots and lots of options is the point. But information, we hope, is power for you to make informed decisions and decide what is the right adventure for you. I believe in choosing your own adventure, and so you'll figure out, once we give you some information, hopefully what the right adventure is for you and your family. But that's part of the way that people sometimes use this genetic information.
Great. We have a couple of questions that came in about testing that has already been completed clinically, and if it would be useful for us to see a copy of those results, and if they've already had clinical exome sequencing, what's the next step that we can provide?
That's fantastic. Again, very insightful. This is a smart group. So yes, absolutely. If you have had clinical genetic testing, helpful to let us know about that and what the results are. That's one of those key medical records that I described. Hopefully you've got a copy of that and can take a picture on your phone or have a PDF of it, and we'll have a way of electronically being able to transfer that to us. That helps us to be able to, in some ways, get a second opinion or have a second opinion of what people have seen, and timestamp it is one key. Because a genetic test, for instance, that was done 5 years ago and didn't find an answer, again, doesn't mean there's not an answer, but means that based on knowledge that the community had 5 years ago, people didn't recognize it. So it is possible in those cases as well that we might think about. I talked about exome sequencing. For those of you that are really sort of savvy about this, there are other methods of analysis that go even beyond what exome sequencing does. We're using some of those methods for other conditions. And if we need to, as a sort of follow-on, we can use some of those other more comprehensive methods of being able to look for genes as well. But a first pass across the community is probably going to be exome sequencing that we pursue. And then, as I said, for some of you, if you had exome sequencing last month and it was normal, you might be someone that we would prioritize for one of these other methods beyond exome sequencing.
We had another question come in about family history and if there was other pulmonary issues in the family history that might not have been diagnosed as NEHI technically, and would that be more helpful, and would those individuals need to be included in the research study?
Oh boy, this is a really sophisticated group. Carly's done a great job of bringing the community together. So absolutely. In the family history, and this is one of the places where Becca may reach back out to you for some clarification on the family history. Number one, NEHI is not always correctly diagnosed, and so there may be individuals who even died for unknown reasons, people who seem to have lung or breathing problems, but depending on where they are, when it was, it may not have been called NEHI. So the answer is yes. People with breathing problems, people especially who died early of unknown reasons or sort of suspicious reasons, are going to be helpful to understand. I'll also say that family history, you know, some families are very close and tight knit, and there may be someone who's medically sophisticated in the family who's been able to transfer that information across the family effectively. Other families, for whatever reason, sometimes geography, people move, they don't stick together. Some people just due to divorces in families and other reasons, knowledge may not be as well known about family history. And so that's okay. You tell us what you know. We try and interpret the best way we understand, and sometimes after we find something genetic, we find that we ripple it through the family. That is, that we go back and start looking at other family members genetically, and suddenly the pieces of the puzzle come together. We realize that, whatever happened to Aunt Sally may in fact have been something that was not correctly diagnosed in the past. So just appreciate this may evolve, and we're pretty adaptable to be able to evolve with it as we gain more information.
Let's see, we've got some more very insightful questions, and this is about the causes of NEHI generally. So is it possible to have different causes? For some families, it may be genetic. For some, it may be because of some sort of event or environmental exposure, and any sort of knowledge around that or understanding of how many might be classified as genetic or otherwise.
Yeah. So I will be pretty transparent. We are really, really good at genetics. Not to be obnoxious about this, but we have done this a long time, and we know what to look for, especially when it comes to genetic conditions in kids. That is really my superpower in the team that I've put together. We do not have the same superpower when it comes to environmental exposures or other things that are not in the gene, but in the environment that you might breathe in that might cause NEHI. And there are things that I think could be misclassified across breathing conditions or lung conditions. So we are going to be laser focused on the genetics first. So we're going to try and do that and chisel away to understand the genetic first, but we're going to keep eyes wide open if we start seeing patterns for other things things that people are reporting or things that they've wondered about, certainly put that in the surveys that you're filling out so that we can be attuned to that. It is hard to be able to use the retroscope to go back to what an exposure might have been a year ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. It's hard to turn back the clock and being able to understand across a population of people what all the people were exposed to, because we just don't have the sort of error that was from 20 years ago in a bottle that we can go back and analyze. So those studies end up being really hard to do. Not saying they're impossible, not saying that you might not have an environmental or toxic exposure, but they're really hard to be able to prove. And so I just don't want to set expectations that we're going to figure that out. But we will try and be just smart, not only with genetics and phone a friend. And luckily, we have lots of friends that we can phone if we start to uncover something else beyond the genetics.
Our next couple of questions are really logistics related, and I'll try and address those. So there's a number of questions about different individuals. Perhaps your child who has NEHI is in college or lives in a different area. So yes, we can absolutely send kits to different locations, and just make sure that you note that when you send an email over to us or in the surveys, and point out that there's a little bit different mailing addresses. That's not a problem at all. We've also had a number of questions about various overseas logistics, and what I can say on that is that the easiest way to handle that is really on a case-by-case basis. So instead of trying to kind of get everybody in this particular moment, go ahead and send an email, and we can try and work with you. I'll work with you one-on-one to see if we can get samples based on your specific situation and where you're coming from, and maybe we can get samples, maybe we can't, but we can certainly try. And then the last question, Dr. Chung, was about local testing, particularly overseas, I think is the question. So if there's a genetic doctor at a local hospital overseas, and they're willing to do the same tests and send the results, is that helpful, and how can that be helpful?
That can be very helpful. So if that's something that you've got access to, again, as Becca was mentioning, we can handle questions that are individually specific on a one-off basis. There are ways of being able to have the diagnostic laboratory send us the raw sequencing files. So not just the test report that you get, but the data behind the report. It's likely you'll have to sign a release for that, permission to be able to do that, but we're able to ingest or accept that information if the laboratory is able to provide it.
And there was one last question, Dr. Chung, about the discussion that you had earlier with about Jing Chen, who had done some research into this, and if there's any more information available about that particular genetic finding.
So that particular genetic finding is a transcription factor, and what that means is that we have a lot of genes, and we have genes that regulate genes. In other words, I think about it as a conductor for an orchestra that's telling the woodwinds when to play or the brass when to play, and those transcription factors coordinate the expression of genes. It's likely in some cases that NEHI is a developmental lung disorder. That is, that it may have its root causes not when you're 5, but really, when you're a fetus, when you're in the womb and developing the lungs themselves. It may not be recognized at that point, but that may be the underlying, we call it pathogenesis, but how it evolves, how it happens. Transcription factors in particular, when it comes to developmental disorders, either the lungs, the heart, the brain, are a very common theme. We see that across conditions. And that's what I was alluding to in terms of in children. We use a lens in terms of thinking about children in particular. Not that if you're an adult with NEHI, we don't know how to look at your information. But for conditions that tend to affect children, you can look at it in a slightly different way than conditions that tend to affect people that are middle-aged or older. And so we use that to our advantage. I think the hope is, and part of the reason I'm excited about this is we have, as I said, when I was joking, but it really wasn't a joke about phoning a friend. We have lots of friends when it comes to lung disorders. NEHI is occasionally associated with autism. We happen to know a whole lot about the brain and autism as well. And so we have other threads that we can pull on. We have friends that study people. We have friends that study mice. We have friends that study cells in the laboratory in addition. So depending on where things go, we're not going to stop with just helping you individually as families. We really are both curious and also motivated to take this to the end in terms of understanding why a gene might cause NEHI, how it might cause NEHI, what we can do to be able to help support individuals, maybe even, dare I say, fix it at some point. We'll see where it goes, but we're not just interested in being able to understand the genes. We're ultimately interested in understanding how to help make people better. We use the genes as a lever. We use it as a tool to help get us there. But really, at the end of the day, we want to empower you to help scientists to be able to make your lives better. And we hope this is the first step.
And then the next question we have is just confirming what's needed to confirm the NEHI diagnosis to enter the study.
Yeah. So to do this, I will say I trust you. So I trust you as parents and patients and participants that you know your own history. So in the interest of moving things forward, if you report a history of NEHI, we believe you. We trust that you're going to do this, in terms of the right reasons, and I don't think you'd have a reason to not accurately report that. So like I said, we trust you on that. We may, in fact, I think it's likely that it will evolve in terms of some cases of genetically specific NEHI. We may get into details of if you had pulmonary function tests, if you had imaging tests to be able to look at your lungs directly, if there are other things in terms of what medications you've been on and when. It may be helpful to document that from notes from your doctors and be able to understand how your lungs responded to some of those medications, to get very granular. And some of those things, I myself can't remember this either for myself or my own patients, so you have to kind of go back and look at the medical record to get a documentation and timestamp about some of these things. So like I said, at the beginning, I think what we want to do is make sure that we're not slowing things down. If you have trouble getting access to certain records or it takes a little while to do things, but to expect that over time it may be back and forth. There may be this sort of evolution of things as the story evolves and as we try and understand things better. So don't think of this as a one and done study. Think of this as hopefully a longer term relationship of being able to understand things better, but with minimal burden. We really are trying to make it easy, but yet accurate and scientifically sound.
And I think we've got one last question, and then that's probably all. And earlier you had mentioned that sometimes individuals who have NEHI are also diagnosed with autism. I'm just wondering if there was any other correlation with other conditions like a connective tissue disorder.
Yeah. So I think in part you're going to educate me. I don't pretend to know everything with NEHI. I think a fair amount, but I don't know everything. I do think there are going to be some people that may have other parts of their body involved. And in fact, those that do have what I'll call non-isolated NEHI, where there is something else involved, it's a hypothesis, it's a best guess, but I'm going to guess that those may be the individuals that are more likely to have a genetic cause that we identify within the first year or so. I could be wrong, but we'll see. So whether that's a connective tissue problem, whether it's autism, whether it's some other behavioral or cognitive issue, whether it's sometimes we see different parts of the body affected. So whether it's connective tissue, in some cases it's heart conditions, but I would suspect that where we see something that's not just isolated NEHI, it may give us hints about where to look and other ways to look at the genetic data that will be helpful.
Thank you. And that was all of the questions that we've received.
Okay. So before I let you go, number one, thank you for your time on a Saturday. I know this is in the middle of a 3-day weekend, so especially thank you for that. And just to say, I consider this just the beginning of a conversation. As we find out more information, we're committed to having more webinars like this where we can share information back that we've learned. We'll always do it in a de-identified way, so you'll never be identified in terms of who you are. It'll always be as a group, whether we distribute the information like this online online with a webinar, whether we publish it in scientific journals, but it'll never have your individual identifying information associated with that. So we hope that that's a way to give back to both you and the rest of the community so that we learn together. Okay. Thank you, Carly, for having us and organizing this. You're an incredible partner to be able to help work with the community.
You're welcome. We look forward to getting the study started.
Okay. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.